Well, welcome to Unite, Unity Temple's weekly interspiritual service. I'm Reverend Nhien, and I'm the lead minister for this service, one of the co-founders, along with Victor Doherty. And we are in a series on the Enneagram, wholeness and the Enneagram. So what this is fundamentally about is this idea that our fundamental nature is that of wholeness, and that our fundamental relationship with the universe is that of oneness and unity. But if you're anything like me, you don't necessarily live out that fundamental truth in your everyday life. And there's a way in which each type along the circle of the Enneagram, each point along the Enneagram, is habituated to not living out that truth in a particular way. So today we'll hear about type 8, and its sort of journey home to awakening to the truth of its nature as both whole in and of itself, and also as one with all of reality, and reality being benevolent, reality being like love itself, of goodness itself, of holiness itself, and the ways in which this particular type is habituated to not seeing that, and to therefore struggling, seeing life as a struggle, seeing it as a kind of jungle out there, if you will. So we'll explore this type, not only for those of you who are this type in your personality, in terms of your personality, but we can look at this Enneagram tool as a map of consciousness as a whole to see how all of us can relate to the ways in which the type 8 gets estranged from the truth of being. So two explorers were out in this jungle when suddenly this ferocious lion jumps out and pounces on the both of them. And the first explorer looks to the second and said, "Wait a minute, be still. Remember the book that we were reading that said that if you are perfectly still and look the lion in the eye, then it will simply just get scared and go away." And the second explorer says, "Well, you've read the book, and I've read the book, but has the lion read the book?" Right? And so he doesn't trust the moment and the action in the moment. When I read the story, I instinctively thought about the 8, the type 8 on the Enneagram, and its stance in the world. For the 8, the world is like this jungle with wild things out there, with dangerous people, dangerous situations, and so we're not going to trust what we read in a book. Instead, we'll carry around some rifles. We'll become strong in the world. And that's the default orientation of this particular type on the Enneagram. Now, depending on sort of the nuances of this particular Enneagram type, that type might be more or less inclined to also be about, you know what? If the world is like this, if we think about Instagram and all the photo filters that we have the pretty filter, we have the rainbow filter, we have the rose-colored glasses kind of filter. The 8's filter on the world can tend to be very black and white. So if the world's dangerous, then my filter is going to be for who are the bad guys, who are the wild animals, who are those that are against me, but also who's on my side, right? And not only who's on my side, like who's going to ally with me, but who am I going to protect, which is on the good side. So a lot of 8's go out in the world not only with their guns armed against those who seem like the evil perpetrators in the world, right? Those who inflict injustices on the innocent, but also they are armed to protect the innocent. And I'm going to explore a little bit about why this might be the case, why the 8's orientation is to that way. So there's a fundamental, there's a slide about the childhood wound of the wholeness that says that in the youth of the 8, whether we call it nature or nurture, there's this fundamental belief that actually the world will betray you, that the world cannot be trusted, That it doesn't matter what anyone tells you, the world cannot be trusted. So the type 8 has lost sight of this fundamental idea that you will not be betrayed. So there's a constant vigilance toward protecting against self and against those who are innocent. And so as the 8 moves into the world, today we're going to look at how that stance actually prevents the personhood of the 8 from coming into the knowing of the full gifts of the love of life, of the richness of relationship, of the bounty of experiencing life more as a garden, as paradise, rather than as a jungle, where there are dangers lurking around every corner. And so we invite here a moment where we can take, like within each of us, this moment to look at what is my stance on the world. Going back a step, if you were the writer of that book about the jungle, what would that book say about the world that you're about to walk into? For an 8, the world is a dangerous place. And because of that, I have to be extra strong. But I'm going to invite each of you in this moment to consider, when you wake up in the morning first, when you wake up and face the day, what does the world look like? And who do you become in response to that? For instance, now the 8's response to this fear-filled world that's dangerous is, I'm going to be big and strong. But the 6 on the Enneagram we've heard before has a stance of, yeah, the world is a fearful place, but my stance in it is that of being meek and not capable of showing up. So I'm going to form alliances and loyalties and find support in partnership or in finances and whatever it is to build security in the world, because the world is an insecure place. So we can all take a step back and go, well, I don't think it's a jungle, but what do I believe? And how do I know that? Because how I orient my day, how I build my entire sort of bearing, is based on the story that I wrote in that book about how to cope with life. What do you do when challenge appears in front of you? Do you toughen up and become strong? Do you go look for your allies and your resources like 6's do? As a type 1, the perfectionist, I have this idea that somehow perfecting myself, working continually to improve myself, somehow immunizes me from the bad of the world. Somehow, if I'm good enough, it's almost like then the universe bestows kindness on me. For the 2 on the Enneagram, there's a story that where there's an inadequate universe out there, hey, if I'm giving enough, if I meet all of your needs, then my needs for protection and love will be taken care of. For the 3 on the Enneagram, the achiever, there's this story. There's a story that if I succeed, if I do enough, that in a way that immunizes me from the dangers of the world, because I will be on top. I will be on top. For the type 4 on the Enneagram, there's a strange sort of backward way in which the 4 can look at it, which is that somehow if I'm special, if I'm unique, but actually often uniquely pained, it's almost like I push my suffering on myself before you do. If I'm uniquely pained, then somehow I'm protected, because if I'm uniquely pained, that makes me special. And in my specialness, I will get some dispensation from the universe. Even my partners, they will come and see how tragic and troubled I am, so they will come to my rescue, perhaps. For the 5 on the Enneagram, there's that idea that if I research enough, I will know how to face any lion that comes, right? But I'm kind of scared to actually trek into the jungle, the wilderness. If I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, what do I do when I face that world? I'm like, wow, well, the world's kind of barren. I don't even see a jungle. The world is like a desert. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a playground, And so the 7's like, this is the way I'm going to get my needs met. I'm going to actually build a world in which all this fun and play exists. So we each respond in different ways. The 9 on the Enneagram responds by saying, hey, well, the world is full of conflict, so I'm going to just tune out. It's almost as if I'm walking through the jungle with my Walkman. Is that dating me? Like with my Walkman. And so if I can't hear the lion's roar, it's not happening, Like I just want to tune out. And then at least my experience of the world is peaceful. So my question first and foremost, before I launch into the specific story of the 8, is what's your story? If you gave the handbook to someone, what would you write? And is your story based on truth? How do you know? How does it get validated? Or have you reached a point in your life where you might be beginning to question your own life paradigm? And whether it's valid and true, whether it actually works for you to get your needs met. So taking a step back into the life of the 8, imagine. So the world feels like I didn't get enough protection when I was young. And on top of that, it felt like people were trying to control me. So the way that I guarded from sort of the cruelness or the viciousness of the world is that I became strong. Those of you who were here in December and heard me talk about like the 8 structure in relationship to its holy idea, it's as if the 8 is not behind a brick wall, but behind a barbed wire fence. Right? So you are not getting in here, and I meet the world on my terms. So I build this kind of strength within me, and I decide that in order to protect myself from being controlled by the outer world, that I'm going to proactively do it. The 8's mantra can be said, the best defense is what? A great offense, right? That is really the motto of the 8. And so as we consider that, we consider the ways in which then what that does in the world is this. The experience of most people with this type is that if the 8 is your boss, they can be domineering, loud, controlling. They exercise their energy. Their way is the right way, is how 8's face life. And 8's have a lust for life. In fact, that's their passion. So there's this idea that like, wow, the universe is this way, here's the jungle, and I'm going to go take all the territory I possibly can for mine. Many people who first come across the Enneagram, like one of their first questions is, how do I deal with the 8's in my life? Because 8's are so big, they impact almost like any room they're in, right? Their largeness and their lust for life. But if we look back to what happens here, is imagine I'm sitting behind my barbed wire fence, and the whole world is then only filtered through this particular wall that I've built. What happens? How many people actually get through that barbed wire fence? How many people get through without bleeding, right? So what happens is the 8 builds a world in which the very things that we all as human beings seek, the love that Summer was talking about, never gets to come in, right? Because it's like by the time it gets in, the people they're wounded by the 8's need to protect itself, if you will. And so as an 8, the invitation is to move into a space where you start to take down your own barbed wire fence and you open up to this idea that maybe the book that you had written about the world is not the truth of things. It might have been your experience in childhood, but what happens is, what we all do is that we take the book and we overlay it onto our actions, right? In the sense that, well, if an 8 believes that everyone's out to get them and they have to be extra strong, they have to be extra aggressive, what happens is they go into an environment and can push everyone away, right? And then they're like, oh, well, see, everyone's going to reject me anyway. I'm going to stay behind this barbed wire fence. And they create the very world that they believed in the first place, not being willing to sort of believe in the capacity for a different world. But what happens is this. If you are an 8, if you have this stance of guardedness in the world, in the beginning, before you start a conscious journey, you don't even know it's there. It's been there for so long. It just feels like that's the way life is. And so the beginning is recognizing just through the ways in which life mirrors back to you, like, oh, oh, you are domineering, you are controlling of your space. To take that feedback as like a recognition that there might be something awry or amiss. And then there's the willingness to become still. In the story, in the jungle story that I opened up with, that book says, become still and look the lion in the eye. And for all the bravado of this type on the Enneagram, which can be angry and domineering, and is often the boss in every situation in its life, to be still, to not move forward and take action, to not pull your rifle out and prepare yourself against the lions of the world. To be still is a moment of such vulnerability that most people won't go there, right? That when the 8 starts to do that, becoming still feels to the type 8 like capitulation. It feels like the weakness of surrender, right? When in life it's really about being a winner. And then there are the losers who are the weaklings out there according to the paradigm of the 8. To become still feels like a profound act of vulnerability. But we can all learn from the lesson that is very specific to 8s in that, as all wisdom teachings say, the beauty and preciousness of life is only available right here. When we are quick to move and act, we have lost sort of our place in that eternal now in which the fullness of the blessing of what is a garden can exist for us. The garden of life that can flourish is only available here. It's not available in the story of the jungle. And I'll bring us back to the original story in the Bible, the story of Paradise Lost. Like in this story, it's a classic story that embodies like the fundamental issue of the 8, which is the moment that Adam and Eve partook of the apple, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It did what an 8 does. It looked at the world and said, black and white, good and bad. And the moment that became so, what happened to the garden? It became not a garden of flourishing, paradise, but instead a place in which you struggle and you toil, and only the fittest prevail, right? So in that moment of taking of the apple, each one of us kind of journeys into this moment where we no longer see reality or truth as it is. We see it through this worldview in which there is duality. There's good and there's bad. The journey of the 8, this part of the Enneagram, reflects all of our need to become so still, to trust that the book that was given and not the book that we wrote reveals the truth. Be still and look life in the eye. And only then will all that you need be given to you. But what happens in this moment is that as the 8, as all of us press through the vulnerability of not applying your particular schemes for life, oh no, but I have to work super hard in order to get my needs met. Oh no, but I have to constantly give in order to get my needs met. Oh no, but I have to improve myself and constantly be on this journey of awakening in order to get my needs met. But if instead of any of those things, I trusted the capacity to be still, what would arise? For each of us, a different quality, but for the 8, the very thing that they pressed down, a sense of their innocence, the sense of who we are before we lost sight of paradise. But in that moment, what happens? In that moment for the 8, and for many of us, that moment feels so vulnerable. Because when we press into the present moment and we don't apply our usual strategies of action or of research or of giving, then the vulnerability of our neediness arises. Like, wow, we see our childlike innocence. We remember the moment when we protected ourselves, which was the moment when we felt needy, dependent as a child. So in all of us, there is that, having that wall be stripped away, having the fragility be felt. And in this, the 8, if you go back to that arrow there, the 8 moves toward the 2 on the Enneagram, and let's explore what that looks like. So in the 8, that points movement toward wholeness. There is an embracing of the qualities of type 2. So type 2 is all relational, right? When the 8 goes unconsciously to 2, what happens is that they can give to others in a way to manipulate others, to continue to be in control of their environment. The 2 is the giver on the Enneagram. It's relational. But when the 8 goes unconsciously to 2, there could be a kind of manipulative giving in order to still hold the stance of the 8, which is, I'm in control. I'm the boss. I have the power. But within that framework, relationship, love, the openness to life can't happen. And so here in Unity, we explore this idea of let's take this conscious journey. And what that means is I'm going to consciously move toward the neediness that is within me, toward that childlike vulnerability that is within all of us. I'm going to consciously move and integrate and let myself sit with the fragility of what that feels like. Because only then can my heart be open, the kingdom of heaven, right, available only to those who approach like a child. Even in the Buddhist tradition, there's a teaching like this that's related to beginner's mind. Like a child, with that innocent state, with beginner's mind that doesn't say, hey, here's my book, and this is what the universe looks like, and this is my guidebook. But instead, feeling into the softness, clinginess, loneliness, neediness, ick. For an 8, if you're an 8, it's like, oh, that's the worst possible thing you could do. In a world that is dangerous, how could you possibly let your guard down? And yet the world of paradise is only available to us if we let our guard and our guidebook down, right? In a moment of stillness. So I invite you again, even as I've shared, perhaps you're beginning to form, if you haven't already, an idea of what those words are in your particular guidebook. What is one way in which you defend against the moment of life? What is just one way that you could possibly set down in a moment of stillness? I can paint some ways in which the 8 does, just to give examples. Those of us who know the Enneagram, well, know that like the 8s in our lives, first of all, they look like they're strong. They don't look like they fear anything because they've built sort of this wall around things. And, you think of 8s. 8s are body types on the Enneagram, so there's this like facility from thought into action that many of us just like stand in awe watching. Everybody else is still thinking about it, and the 8 has finished, right? So the 8's capacity to move in the world is phenomenal. The 8's capacity to protect the innocent, the mother hens. The 8s are the often firefighters and police people, men and women, that these are the folks who will take action for us often, right? So this is the stance in the world. But ironically, the 8's fear of its own invulnerability is actually what makes it deeply vulnerable. And let me explain that. If I am not in touch with the fact that my body is weak or tired or sick, I'm going to keep marching out in the world thinking that I could do 10 things in one day, right? Because I'm not actually in touch with myself. So even though I'm a body type as an 8, I'm not still enough to truly inhabit my body in a way to experience its vulnerability. I have blinders against my own vulnerability, which makes me more vulnerable to burning out. And if I'm not in touch with my vulnerability emotionally, what happens is that we all know that empathy, Brené Brown talks about this. She's like the queen of teaching vulnerability in this world, right? So Brené Brown talks about how, she shares this beautiful story about how one time her daughter shared about some insecurity she had in high school. And Brené Brown was like, yeah, I could have been all like the mother, looking down and going, "Aw, poor you, and let me console you." But instead, the act of vulnerability that she took was, I had to feel into what it was like when I was a teenager and how vulnerable I felt and how that was and how insecure I was as a kid in order to really have compassion and be with my daughter. And so the 8, in order to actually deeply relate to their loved ones, needs to actually drop behind the, I will simply protect you, feeble people, right? And instead join by being able to tap into the soft place in the 8's own heart, right? That like, oh my goodness, like I feel the vulnerability. It's not your vulnerability, and I'm going to protect you. And that brings me full circle to what I shared in the beginning. Why is it that 8's in particular are the defenders of children, the innocent, the weak, of animals? Because somewhere in that gesture is an unconscious way in which the 8 is trying to protect itself. That there's that vulnerable part that you've denied and then projected out in the world. And so the path of healing, the path of integration, is to not continually see it, vulnerability and danger even, as out there, but to bring it back home and to feel it in your own being. And in that, somehow, through that act of vulnerability, paradise opens up. The holy idea that the type 8 has lost sight of is the idea of holy truth. And holy truth, what that means, that face of reality, what that means is that we are all one. That there is no division of good, no black and white, no higher and lower. When I was a kid, there was this game called King of the Mountain. And I don't know if you guys played it. I didn't actually play it, but I watched others play it. And basically, you go and you look for the biggest mound you can find, like a mound of dirt or a hill. And it's basically all these kids gather around and push each other off the hill. Like the idea is that you push everyone else off so you can be king of the mountain. And so to me, that embodies like the 8's stance in the world, right? In denying, in actually knowing my fragility and how cruel the world is, the only way I'll make it is to be on top. And so the act of vulnerability that brings us all into the remembrance of our unity with all life, where paradise is indeed found again, is this act of equality with people that decides consciously that I am not above and here to protect you. But when I have that instinct, I might look within myself to be like, why am I ultra compassionate only when people are broken and weak and not when they're just equal to me? And to look at that and go, maybe it's because there's compassion I need to extend to integrate something within me. And as I do so, as an 8, I move toward 2. And the 2, through the 2, I become this vehicle for this deep magnanimity in the world, this profound giving and generosity of spirit in the world that doesn't need to guard and protect, but flows evenly and includes me as one with all of you. That I am not above protecting anymore. And that finally, I get to have the love, the joy, the peace that I've been seeking because I've let down my rifle, because the world isn't what I thought it was. But I won't know that if I keep taking action out into the world. So, the motto of the 8 at the average level of health, never go to bed angry, stay up and fight. And from Bruce Fernstein, never settle with words what you can accomplish with a flamethrower. We've seen these people in our lives. And then finally, how many 8's does it take to screw in a light bulb? None. We 8's aren't afraid of the dark, right? So many of us know 8's in our lives. They're often our bosses. They take that role. They are leaders, and they shine in that capacity. So the issue isn't 8-ness. It's the ways in which 8-ness locks anyone with that orientation into a world that never feels like one that you can rest in. That always feels like one that you have to be vigilant in to protect yourselves and the people you love. And if you can't find rest, the world then isn't a place of paradise at all, right? It's a place in which you toil for your good. And you toil to the point where you usually overwork yourself and break yourself down. And so again, the invitation is, it's not because it's bad to be that way, but because it hurts you to be that way. And it hurts all of us in the ways that we divide and aren't willing to embrace a vulnerability that gives us a sense of unity and belonging with the world. And so I want to close with that last slide there. The virtue of the 8 as it integrates is that of innocence. And I love this quote. It says, the innocent being responds freshly to each moment without memory, judgment, or expectation. In innocence, one experiences reality and one's connection to its flow. And so my invitation to each and every one of us today as we prepare for a time of meditation is to see if we can set down our guidebook for life and how we'll guard ourselves and prepare ourselves for life. And just simply be willing to enter into a moment where you can feel the rawness of whatever is alive for you. If you're grieving, if you're angry, if you're longing, if you're lonely, if you're sad, or even if you're happy, that there's a vulnerability to simply being still and being in this moment. So as you bring your attention gently back into the space of this room and of our togetherness, I invite you, to the extent that you can, stay tapped into this place within you that is always still. And let your movement and your speech stem and flow from that place of peace and stillness as you move forth into your day and into this week.